Well, first of all, good morning. Thank you for being here. I'd like to know first, everyone I ask about how they entered the industry usually tells a very convoluted story with a lot of turns. How did you enter the games industry?
Well, I'm afraid it's another convoluted story with a lot of turns. I started as a games journalist, originally freelance, working for a women's magazine. Unusually, it was a women's magazine called Minx in the UK, and it was aimed at 18 to 24-year-old women. And I think I started off writing a few bits and pieces just on random stuff. I think I reviewed a couple of graphic novels. It was a little bit more rock and roll than other women's magazines at the time. And yeah, they let me do a few pieces on graphic novels. I think I wrote a piece about women gamers, and they knew I was into games, and they decided to cover games in the magazine, which was unprecedented for women's magazines at the time, and even now. Sort of 20 years later, you wouldn't expect to see it in women's magazines. And they asked me if I wanted to cover it. That allowed me to get onto the press releases and press list of lots of PRs in the games industry. And then they started sending me code. And I reviewed for about maybe 4 issues before the magazine redesigned and became all about lipstick and boys, and just like every other magazine at the time. But it was enough to get my foot in the door. And it was actually at I think it was Tomb Raider 3. It was the launch of Tomb Raider 3 at the Natural History Museum that I went along as my dad's +1. And I was at a table with a guy that was just becoming a reviews editor on a games magazine called PC Gear, which was the sister magazine to PC Zone. And he started to give me some reviews work on PC Gear, and then PC Zone were looking for a games writer, an editorial assistant. So I did an interview there, and I think I'd been interviewing around a lot of computer magazines at the time, and they'd all been suggesting that maybe I should go for a gaming magazine instead, because that was obviously what I was interested in. And so I spent a couple of years at PC Zone, going all around the world and interviewing developers and seeing how games were put together. And then in sort of 2002, 2003, I left to go freelance again, and I was contacted by Sven of Larian Studios, and he was looking for sort of story polishing help with Beyond Divinity that they were doing at the time. And I was a big fan of Divine Divinity, terrible name, but a good game, and they remembered that I liked it, and they just wanted to see if I was available. And so I just helped them out with that, and I didn't know anything about games writing at the time. All the time I'd been a journalist, there was no me. No one sat me down and went, here's the writer, or even, here's our designer who also does some writing. Like, no one talked about it at all. So it was really uncharted territory. And I came out of it and I thought, this seems like an interesting way of working and paying the bills. I wonder if I can get more work like this. And so I started using some of the contacts I made as a journalist, and I just went up to them and said, hey, I'm doing this now. Can I get some work, please? And the industry was kind of so young in terms of actually employing writers, not in narrative as a whole, but employing writers that people went, oh, okay, then, yeah, we could probably use a bit of help. And so I kind of just got in that way, and it was very random, and it was all kind of made up as I went along, and I had no mentors because most of the time I was the only writer on a team. So I was never really in a situation where there was someone on a team that knew more than I did. So I had to kind of cut through the kind of narrative jungle on my own, and fail and succeed on my own, and I had no one to teach me. I just had to learn on the job.
How you explained it, writers back then, I guess even right now, are sometimes used as a last-minute help to fix things, to make things right. How do you remember these first roles? So how much of a mess were the games writing back then?
Well, I coined the phrase narrative paramedic a long time ago to describe this sort of work. I think Mirror's Edge was probably my biggest narrative paramedic work, and it wasn't so much that it was right at the end of the project I was brought in, but the fact that everything had been designed with no narrative in mind when I was brought in. So if you remember Mirror's Edge, then like the levels had all been designed, the look of the game had all been designed, the levels had been conceptually designed, the way that the character moved through the game and the way that Faith looked had all been designed, but no one had thought about why. So no one had thought about why does she move like this? Why does the city look like this? What is the reason why any of this is happening? They just kind of designed it because it was cool movement. It gave different ways of the players exploring the world. It was kind of original. It was a sort of unusual-looking, near-futuristic city. And basically, a lot of it was done because it was cool and it felt right, but no one had thought about why. And so I had to go in and kind of wrap a narrative around what was there, which is the completely backwards way of working for other entertainment mediums. And that was probably my biggest narrative paramedic job, and I think that we managed to do the best we could with the time and budget we had available, but obviously if I had been employed earlier in the process, all of that could have been designed at the same time, rather than kind of sort of shoving narrative in later. But I hear about all kinds of bad practices over the years. I mean, when writers kind of get together and the alcohol is flowing, the sort of stories come out, and you hear about times writers have been asked to like turn around 100,000 words in a week, or they have to rewrite. And the writer's been brought in to rewrite every cut scene, but it has to be every line has to be the exact length of every previous line that's been in there, and just all sorts of kind of crazy stuff that I've never heard about happening in any other industry. And it's just because writing is, it's often the last thing thought of and the first thing pulled apart by the rigors of games development. So it's often the case that if a writer, there used to be a vogue for getting Hollywood writers in, particularly in the noughties, and kind of the late 90s, and there was this view that Hollywood writers could come in and sprinkle their magic pixie dust over games and narrative would be magically better. But no one really knew how to work with writers, so they couldn't really get the best out of them. The writers themselves didn't really know how games work, and the game scripts have to be hugely iterative. They have to kind of work alongside the level design and the mechanic design. And so often the kind of work would be unusable, or some other poor, some games writer that was being paid a fraction of what the Hollywood writer was paid had to come in and basically sort everything out at the end. Writing and narrative wasn't really given the love and attention that other aspects of game development were given. It was sort of seen as kind of a second-class citizen. It was seen as something that anyone could do, that you didn't have to be particularly skilled at doing it, that if you could write words and you'd read a book or a TV show, then you magically knew how to write a story. And it was the only part of game development for a long time that wasn't done by a professional skilled in that field. And when I started out in the games industry as a journalist, that there was genuinely a question going around the industry that, do games need professional writers? It was like, well, they've got professional artists and professional musicians, and everyone else is a professional. Why skimp on writing?
To what extent do you think that has changed in AAA development? Or are writers still called at the last minute to knit set pieces together?
I mean, there is still a bit of that. I don't tend to take on so many of those roles now, and to be honest, my work in games at the moment is quite limited. I do a lot more of my work in film and TV these days, but it's been so interesting being part of the games industry and seeing it change over the years, because obviously I started out as a games journalist when there wasn't a me around, and then it wasn't, there's a quote along the lines of you can't be what you can't see, and I've never felt that applied to me. It was like, I can't see it, therefore I'm going to go and be it because it's not there, and therefore, yeah, that's something that I can do. That's new territory, and I've always been excited by that. But now there are so many more professional writers in the industry. We're growing our own talent. We're getting many more teams of writers' rooms. It's kind of rare that you'll be brought onto a high-level project and you'll be the only writer. And like you won't have at least narrative designers or a narrative director. And so I feel, and so much has changed. Narrative conferences, you've got awards for game script writing, and I've kind of seen it all change in the last 20 years that I've been part of the industry, and it makes, because I'm now working in other industries as well, it makes me feel a bit like kind of very much an aged veteran with kind of one foot out of games, but I feel a little bit like Roy Batty at the end of Blade Runner, where it's like I've seen narrative designers on fire on the shoulder of Lara Croft, that kind of thing. And yeah, it's been exciting to see that change. And it's still a way to go. But just having other writers to work with, having narrative designers, and other narrative professionals in the mix means so much. You're so reliant on the team around you.
You have mentioned that all the other media that you write for, you write pretty much for every media existing. What is the key thing that makes writing for video games special for you, and how do you approach the different media that you write for?
What makes games different is the player. With most other entertainment mediums, you are more or less passively absorbing the story. The story is being told to you. I'd say when you're reading it, it's slightly more active because you're kind of imagining it, and I think there is a relationship between the author's words and the reader that is quite unique, but it's still not to the level of games by any sense. But by and large, you're passively absorbing the story. You're being told the story. With games, you are the story. The story is happening because of you, or at least that's what it's supposed to feel like. You are shaping it, you are pushing it forward, you are the story. And so that makes it incredibly powerful. We can put players into the shoes of so many characters in so many different situations and take them to so many different worlds and take them on these great adventures and journeys. And I think that makes it incredibly powerful. I mean, I never know how to answer the how do you approach it question, because it's like, I mean, with games, there's a certain amount of fear and trepidation that you approach any project with, because, as I say, you're so reliant on the team around you and the narrative sensibilities and the time and budget. There's no one project of mine has been the same as another. They've all been very different, and it really depends on, when you're brought on board is a big factor, like time and budget, another one. How much, as I said, the narrative sensibilities of the team, who you're working with, your role. Like there are now different roles for writers in writing teams. So I did a lot of the cinematic work on Tomb Raider. I did a lot of the Lara journals and some of like Lara's father's journals in Rise, and everything Lara-y I had quite a big hand in. And so, but we had other writers doing like artifact text and things like that. And when I worked on BioShock Infinite, I did what we call barks in the games industry, so the short lines of dialogue that are often played during combat or during idling situations. So I worked on the Vox Pop and the Founders barks for BioShock Infinite, but I didn't touch any other part of it. That was the specific part I was working on. And I've often been involved in kind of writers' teams where I've been kind of backing them up, doing round the edges bits and pieces, or they've been doing it for me. And it's really nice to kind of have those different opportunities.
You've mentioned Lara a couple of times. Writing for a game such as Tomb Raider, I guess it's a challenge because you have to rewrite the character up to some extent. but you have to keep it true with the story and nature of the character. How, how, how was the experience of taking that iconic character and trying to make it new, make her new again?
I mean, I think Crystal were very open to kind of new ideas and kind of new ways of exploring the character. And when I came on board, the looks for Lara had been established, but it was actually one of the visuals was something that drew me into it. I mean, if you look at the covers for kind of Tomb Raider and Rise, in particular, if you look at you can actually see the evolution of the character in the artwork, and it's such a different, it's such a different way of marketing the character. I think that it really appealed to me because I'd been put off as a younger gamer by the marketing of old Lara Croft and the sort of sexualized marketing, and more than that, the gendered marketing, like her just being marketed towards guys, and it's like the ha ha ha, your girlfriend will be jealous of you playing with Lara Croft, and it was just like I hate that kind of marketing, and it really put me off. And so seeing kind of new Lara, and I think with the first game, the 2013 reboot, she's sort of standing in the cave, and she's sort of holding her arm, and she's kind of looking down slightly, and it's sort of, she's still, but she's got her weapons with her, so there's a lot of character in the artwork, and that really drew me in because it wasn't the kind of sexualized artwork where it's all very either boobs out or that special position that marketeers like to get female characters into, where both you get boobs and arse in the same shot. There wasn't any of that, and it was a stunning piece of artwork. It was about her character, and then when you look at Rise, the transition of the character between the two games is reflected in the artwork. So she's looking up, she's holding the glow stick up, and you can see that she is she's becoming proactive, and that was one of the differences between Lara in Tomb Raider and Rise. In the Tomb Raider, she was reactive, she was reacting to the circumstances that were being thrust upon her, but in Rise she was proactive, she was chasing the secrets down, and that was reflected in the artwork. So that was one of the things that drew me in. And I think we just spent a long time kind of batting about ideas and talking about how we wanted to kind of explore, and particularly for me this is important, explore the dynamic and the conflict and the drama between being human and being the hero. So being human and having friendships and being scared and feeling vulnerable and turning to others for help and realizing that you have to save yourself and realizing that you have the ability to save yourself, and kind of being eventually this superhero-like figure who has to save everyone. And that was something I explored a lot in the Dark Horse comics as well. And for me, that was very interesting. And it was just about kind of giving her a kind of backstory and all sorts of details that came out in strange ways that I would kind of be playing around with her bio and stuff, and I'd make up something like the name of her archery club at university, and then suddenly I'd see it on notebooks in the Tomb Raider online shop. There was the Sisters of Artemis notebooks. You can get Sisters of Artemis mugs, and this is just something I made up whilst writing the bio because I thought it might be fun. So I spent a lot of time exploring her backstory and kind of rooting her in London and her relationship webs and how all the characters play into that and how her character evolves through the gameplay as well. And I think Crystal, they gave me a decent amount of space to play with. I wasn't there at the start, so obviously I was working within the confines of the loose story that they had and the setting that they had.
You have written for blockbusters such as Tomb Raider, but also for smaller games. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of Overlord, for instance. I love that game. How was that, in turn, that experience of writing a smaller game where I guess you had more freedom and you could set the tone?
Yeah, I always cite Overlord as actually being my most favorite game to work on, which I think people are surprised about. I mean, it wasn't like the smallest game I've worked on by a long way. It was probably in the middle ground of games, which was, back then, it was a little bit more of a flourishing area. I think over the years we've seen the middle ground get eaten away a bit. There seems to be a bigger separation. So you've got the big budget AAA games, you've got the kind of smaller budget indie games. When I started out in the industry, the middle ground was really flourishing, and that's been kind of eroded over the years. But I think Overlord was kind of in that middle ground. And that meant that it had, decent funding and support from Codemasters, but the IP was still owned, at least for the first game, not for the second game, by Triumph. And so there was a certain, I was working very closely with the developers who are based in the Netherlands, and I think my sense of humor just gelled with theirs, and I could capture the tone that they were looking for, and like even some of my audition pieces for them actually made it into the final game, I think. And I was just able to hit exactly tonally what they wanted for the game, and they just gave me a lot of kind of space to work. They didn't interfere too much in what I was doing. I was the only writer on it, so I wrote everything that, from the cutscenes to the barks to the weapon text and everything like that. And I worked very closely with the level designers. So each time we were going through a level, they put a brief together for me about what was needed from their perspective from a level, like what was going on, what the player would experience during that level, and what needed to be there from a narrative point of view in order to support that gameplay and those mechanics. So it might be that the particular new boss appeared, or a new small enemy, or a new mechanic was introduced, or a new minion was introduced, and they needed me to support that in the story. And likewise, they'd talk to you about where there was space for me to do more narrative work, or where there could be a cutscene. And so I just worked with the level designers closely, putting together a script that worked exactly for their level to their brief. And that meant that when the script went up to the creative director, he knew that the level designer had been involved, that they had okayed it, that it worked for them. And that just meant that when they got the script back, it was more or less as they expected, and they could put it into their level with the minimum amount of fuss and pain. And I think that works well for everyone. It wasn't a case of they were just given a script and they had to make it work. It was very kind of organically done. And they also sort of entrusted me to help out with the voice directing as well. So I co-directed the voices on Overlord, and I directed the voice acting on Overlord 2 as well. And I cast it, and that was really nice to do. And I think on smaller teams, there's more trust, because there has to be more trust. And like if you can do things and you've got the time to do it, and you think you can do it decently, then they'll let you do it. Whereas on bigger teams, there's like layers and layers of people in between. Like there are layers of people in between myself and the level designer that might be implementing script, or myself and the actors. So I think the smaller the team, the more hands-on you can be.
What game would you like to write for or to take on from the whole history of video games? If you could, someone come to you, hey, would you like to write for this game? Which one would be?
I've stopped thinking like that before, because it used to be Thief, and then I worked on a Thief game, and that turned out not great. And so, so I've stopped that kind of mad fantasies, because, the Thief game was, I wasn't involved in the last year of it, and it didn't turn out as I would have liked a Thief game to be. I'm a big fan of Vampire the Masquerade, so I'd love to work on a Vampire the Masquerade game. But now, I worry about saying that, because if it happens, maybe I'm cursed. Maybe if I really want to do it, then maybe that's a bit of a curse. So I don't know, it's the new stuff. It's the new stuff that's most interesting to me. It's the building new characters and new worlds and IPs. So, I was lucky with something like Heavenly Sword. That was helping build out a new IP there. I mean, obviously it didn't get further than the first game, but there was a second game in development at one point. Mirror's Edge, obviously that had a sort of a second game, there's sort of a soft reboot of the first game, but I wasn't involved in that. But there was something kind of exciting about building new worlds and building new characters and coming up with weird names like Mirror's Edge, which was one of like about 1,000 names I came up with in the process of trying to name that damn game. And I remember everyone thought it was too weird and
It sounds like a new metal band name.
Yeah, it was just like, well, we couldn't have anything to do with speed or momentum because it was all taken by racing games. And I was like, then let's just go rogue. Let's come up with something that's no one has done before, that works with, once you see the game and you see all the reflective surfaces, and that they talk about running the mirror's edge. The mirror's edge is the edge of the reflection, where you're kind of safest at the edge of the mirror, and that's the space that they occupy. And it kind of works, and then after a while, people just accepted that's the name of the game, and just those. Building those worlds, that most excites me. It's not the IPs that are already there, but the IPs that are yet to come.
Thank you very much. Let's open the microphone, see if the audience has any questions. We have time for a couple of questions, I guess. Thing is, I don't see anything with this light in front of my face.
There's a gentleman there.
There's a gentleman there, yeah. There's a microphone, or you have one? Right there. Si quieres puedes hacerla en español y traduzco yo, lo que prefieras.
Yo puedo hablar de los dos. One of the things I wanted to ask was, how did you deal with the sort of very obviously misogynistic reaction to people seeing you change Lara Croft and making her into, I guess somebody more respectable than what she was originally made for? And basically, did you get any sort of bad feedback from people specifically about the changes you were making to her?
Well, to be fair, I don't think all the pushback was misogynistic in tone. I think a lot of I do think there's a lot of good stuff about classic Lara, and I do think the games were a lot of fun. But I think she was let down by her marketing. I think the marketing put across a different game and character to how she was in the game. I feel that they were at odds, and it felt like the character in the game wouldn't have had any truck with the way she was marketed. And so I think that was a big letdown. And I think that was something we kind of definitely addressed with the kind of reimagining. But I do think there was good stuff about her. I think she was kind of fun and adventurous and no nonsense, and she had good, she had definitely good qualities, and I could see why she was so exciting and interesting to players. And I can see why, they might be concerned about losing that. And what we were doing was not to say classic Lara was bad. It was just like, this is what we're doing to explore a new area. What is that noise? Okay. This is just a new area of Lara we're exploring. We're not saying past Lara is bad. There's a lot of good stuff about her, but now we're doing something different. Now we're exploring her at a younger age. She's not so. She's not the Lara with the witty one-liners, which was a disappointment to me because I love doing that sort of thing. But Crystal specifically didn't want me to do that because they thought it would show that she was too confident, that she had confidence that she didn't yet have as a character at the time. And so they wanted me to kind of dial that way back and sort of reduce humour quite a lot, which was difficult for me to do because I'd written about 5 Overlord games in some form or other. So I really enjoyed doing that. So it wasn't. I kept trying to sneak bits of humor in, but they kept making me pull it back. So I got more into the comics. So I got kind of more lively Lara and a little bit more classic Lara into the comics. I mean, there was a lot, as I'm sure you're aware, there was some controversies early on with a trailer for the first game, and I wasn't introduced at the time, and there was some sort of stuff said about a certain scene that wasn't really accurate, and then I had to kind of talk about it later, and the decisions that we'd made, and I was glad that we were able to have that kind of conversation. And that was kind of important, but there was a lot of kind of churn at the time, and when I was kind of introduced, and I saw blog posts about did I hate men, and then blog posts about did I hate women, and it was just kind of crazy stuff, and like seeing headlines in like the Sun or the Mirror saying Lara Croft in Island rape hell. And having to phone up my parents and go, I didn't do this, this is not right, this is not what it is. And that's just a bit strange. But I think I got angry feedback about the fact that, this is a spoiler, more white characters die than anyone else in the first game. And minority characters tend to make it through. And I got angry emails about that, but it's kind of like, well, you know, you're bigots, so I don't really care about what you think. If you're getting angry about that, you think I've got a white genocide agenda, then I don't really care about what you think. But you know, I do think there has been a rush to kind of say, oh well, you know, new Lara is because old Lara is bad, and that's not true at all. There are great stuff about classic Lara, there's great stuff about new Lara. Those things should coexist happily. We shouldn't like try and, as so often happens in the real world, we shouldn't look to set up one woman against another woman. They can both coexist, they're both great.
We have time for one last question. This one, yep. In the back.
Well, okay. First of all, you have said about the professionals and like writers in the market. I would like to know if you have some advice to career path for the newers nowadays. And if you permit, if I can, I would like to know also how is to create a dialogue in video games, if it's different from other products, other entertainment products, and how is this process?
Okay, there's I don't know how well I'm going to be able to answer that in the time, but the 3 bits of advice anyone that I have wanting to go into games writing is write, network and play. So play lots of games, play all kinds of games, all genres of games, from AAA to indie and everything in between. Look at the different ways that narrative is used, particularly the ways that are unique to games or used more in games than other entertainment mediums, like environmental storytelling, like using level design or mechanics to underline the story, to underline the narrative of the world. Look at the ways that animation is used, look at the way that music is used, look at the way that art and environment is used to underpin the story. You know, there's some great examples of where games are doing things, you know, very differently from other mediums, or you know, sometimes without words at all, without kind of traditional storytelling mechanics. So just play lots of games and see what's out there, and see what's being used, see what companies are creating what. Write. You know, a writer writes. It's not a, you know, you don't take a course and then tick, you're a writer. It's an ongoing process. You know, you're always writing. You're always honing your skills. You're always taking courses, reading books, practicing. You know, trying new ways of writing, trying to write for other mediums, studying. It's not a skill. It's a skill that you have to keep working at, unfortunately, and you will get better at it little by little. you know, you might not be able to perceive it yourself, or you will, but you've just got to keep on writing. And then network. Go to events like this. Go to things like GDC or develop, and especially things that have a show floor where you can go and meet developers, where you can go and talk to them about maybe what their narrative needs are. You can start working with small teams. You know, Kickstarter, Indiegogo. Sometimes those teams need writers. You know, or you can kind of meet up with other game writers. The IGDA has a writer special interest group that has a kind of an email messaging. Can't think of the word when like a group messaging thing, email thing, where you know, writers will post on there that are, you know, experienced long-term professionals like myself, and sometimes they might be narrative designers, sometimes they might be writers that are just looking to get into the industry. So there's a lot, sort of wealth of information there, and so that's very useful. There are loads of books out there on games writing from writers that have been in the industry for a long time. The Writer SIG itself has produced, I think, 3 books now that are all written by members of the group that cover everything from kind of working with voice actors to the needs of the audience, to kind of writing humor. And you know, the trouble is there is no one way of doing games writing, which makes it very hard for me to kind of answer the second part of your question, because obviously the needs of a game's narrative change from the genre of a game. For example, like the needs of a first-person shooter might be very different from the needs of an adventure game or the needs of a role-playing game. A game that's more cinematic, like Tomb Raider, has different needs to something like, you know, Dragon Age or Mass Effect that has more branching dialogue. So a game with a strong cinematic element like Tomb Raider has a script, has one part of the script that looks a lot like a movie script. It can sometimes have more direction to do with what has been happening in the gameplay, whereabouts you might be entering the script from a level design, entering the cutscene from a level design perspective. And so by and large, yeah, it looks like a movie script, but you might have a company might be using something like Artisy, for example, to create branching narrative, and that looks very different. Sometimes companies create their own branching narrative system, which they will teach you when you get involved. But you know, a lot of scripts do look vaguely like a movie script, and unless it's very, very branching. But then you can have loads of Excel documents that are just full of one-lines, the barks, and they're frequently done in Excel, which is the least exciting program to write into, and it's the least comfortable for actors to read from, but it's the most easy to manage lots of lines of dialogue. So a lot of stuff is actually done in Word and Excel, which is deeply unsexy and basic, but there you go. And you know, it's not like screenplay writing, where you know that a screenplay is going to be roughly between 90 to 120 words. Game screenplays can go on for you know, 2 or 3 times as longer in the movie, and then there could be other scripts as well that are just scripts for the artifact text or secondary narrative, or they're just for letters or documents or barks or things like that. So there's kind of no one way of doing it. But if you kind of look at all the resources I've talked about, hopefully those often will have little snippets of game scripts in for you to look at.
Thank you very much, Rhianna. Please, a huge round of applause for her.